I'm presenting something that's a work in progress, so I'm really excited to get your feedback. The title is Effective Governance Through Evidence, Support for Evidence-Based Policing and Professional Standards. And I am doing this paper along with Emily D. from Wichita State University. So I want to start by focusing on a research gap. So we have a lot of information about the reforms the public wants from police departments. So a whole variety of things like body-worn cameras, no-knock warrants, duty to intervene and stop and frisk, among a whole host of reforms. So we know a lot about what the public wants in terms of police reforms. There's a gap, however, in that we know there's little research about what the public wants in terms of selecting police chiefs. So a lot of information about what we want in terms of police reforms, but little about what we want in terms of police chiefs. And the little that we do know about what the public wants in terms of police chiefs, it really relates to things in terms of descriptive representation, which is important, like race and gender in particular, but not a whole lot beyond that. And so the goal here is to fill that gap, or at least to add to the little research that we do have. And so the reason why this is important, as you all know, is that police chiefs play a central role in a whole host of things, developing the agency's vision, setting priorities, defining reward structures, overseeing recruitment, promotion, and demotion sometimes, allocating resources, communicating and coordinating with stakeholders, and lastly, role modeling ethical behavior and concern for their employees. So police chiefs matter, and so we should want to, at least in my mind, we should want to know what the public wants in police chiefs, particularly in a democratic society. So the central research question is, what credentials matter to the public in the selection of police chiefs? And I'm gonna look at a number of characteristics, but I'm gonna, in my discussion here, I'm gonna focus on these two. I'm gonna look at evidence-based policing and professional standards. So we're going to look at a variety of factors, but I'm going to hone this sort of literature review on evidence-based policing and professional standards. And so I'm going to give you a preview of where I'm going so that you don't fall asleep too quickly. This is going to end with an experiment, and in the experiment, I'm going to give respondents hypothetical candidates for police chiefs, and they're going to choose among them. And so this is what it would look like to the person taking this survey or this experiment. So you have attributes on the side, you have two different candidates, and they're gonna select among them. So that's where we're going. So the first part, like I said, I'm gonna talk about evidence-based policing, and I'm talking about first the origins of evidence-based policing. So this term was first coined in 1998 by a criminologist named Lawrence W. Sherman, and he developed this concept of evidence-based policing out of the evidence-based medicine movement. And so here's a direct quote from that 1998 article. He says, this is how he describes evidence-based policing: the use of the best available research on the outcomes of police work to implement guidelines and evaluate agencies, units, and officers. So not only is it about sort of implementing what we know works best, but it's about using those practices to evaluate officers, agencies, and units. And so the idea is that we do use evidence rather than these other things. So rather than theory, assumptions, tradition, or convention. And so this might seem sort of obvious to all of us, but at the time, this was a novel idea, which may sound silly, but it was. And it's still, well, I'll get into that. But and so he thought that the outcome of this would be that policing would be more cost effective because you're dropping practices that don't really work. It would reduce harm because, government has coercive power, and so, especially a police department, and so if you use that incorrectly, you could create harm. And then lastly, it would enhance police legitimacy as departments see that they're using, or the public sees the departments are using more effective practices. I'm gonna talk about, there's like two camps in evidence-based policing. This is not necessarily germane, at least in my mind, it's not germane to the outcomes of this research, but I'm gonna present it because it's important just to be aware of this, if you're not already. So there's this first camp, which basically says, the only thing that matters is what we know from experiments, so randomized controlled trials, and maybe sort of quasi experiments. But this camp is, let's just do randomized controlled trials, and the only way we conceptualize evidence is stuff based off of randomized controlled trials, essentially. And so people from this group might say something like this: without rigorous methods, claims of effectiveness are merely assumptions. And so this is in contrast to the second group, which would say imperfect evidence is still better than no evidence if judiciously used. And not only is this second camp less concerned about whether the sort of effectiveness, how we define effectiveness is based off randomized controlled trials or not, but this group also incorporates practical judgment or practical knowledge from police practitioners. And this group also includes the idea of democratic value. So what the public actually wants matters just as much as what evidence says. And so here's a quote from this camp: "The decision-making process, which integrates the best available evidence, as well as professional judgment, and as well as community values, preferences, and circumstances." And so, once again, this is not doesn't impact my findings, but I'm just bringing this because I don't want to present it as this sort of one unified group that believes everything and agrees upon everything, because that's not the case. And so next I want to talk about the rise of evidence-based institutions. And I have it in green because I really like the sort of phrasing of this conference, because we're talking about government successes. And it's really easy to forget that for the most part, government does things really well, right? And there's a lot of things to be happy about. And so there's a lot of things to be happy about, in my opinion at least, in terms of the rise of evidence-based institutions, because there are a number of them. So in 2000, there's a group called the Campbell Collaboration Crime and Justice Group that was established. And what they do is just systematic reviews. It's funded by nonprofits, and mostly by nonprofits. And they just do a bunch of systematic studies about various policing initiatives. The Center for Evidence-Based Crime and Policy at George Mason University was founded in 2008, and it's had a huge impact on what we know about evidence-based policing. They do a lot of rigorous research and interact and work with police practitioners. In 2012, in the United Kingdom, the Society for Evidence-Based Policing was founded. In Australia and New Zealand, in 2013, the Society of Evidence-Based Policing was founded. And in 2015, we founded the American, not we as myself, but in America, the Society of Evidence-Based Policing was founded. And in 2015, the Canadian Society of Evidence-Based Police was founded. And so assuming that everyone here thinks evidence is good, I'm saying that there are these positive developments in which we're increasingly investing in learning about what works in terms of policing. So positive stuff going on. And so there's a lot of research about evidence-based policing. I'm going to talk about some of that research, and I'm going to talk about the gap, which I sort of mentioned earlier. I'm not going to get into the details of all these findings because it's not necessarily germane to this, and I don't have the time, or we don't have the time. But so there's a lot of research about officers' awareness of the term evidence-based policing, and I'll just say some of these. Briefly, we know that officers have become more aware of this term evidence-based policing. There's research about how officers define evidence-based policing. There's research about officers' receptivity towards evidence-based policing, perceived barriers to evidence-based policing, and the uptake of practices associated with evidence-based policing. We have all of this research, but there's a gap. The gap is there's a lack of scholarship about whether the public cares about having evidence-based police chiefs. And this matters because if you want to have evidence-based police departments, you need leadership that actually believes in evidence, right? And the way you get leadership that believes in evidence is that you have the public that demands that leadership. And so we don't know whether the public even cares, and if they don't care, then you're not going to get that leadership, essentially. And so another reason why this is important is that the adoption of evidence-based policing is very sort of spotty. It's increased, but it's very hit or miss across departments, across policies. And one of the biggest barriers to greater adoption of evidence-based policing is a lack of supportive leadership to make it happen. And so police chiefs play a central role in evidence-based policing, and I'm going to tell you about how. And so I did want to point out that a lot of this sort of goes to the presentations earlier, both Wendy and also, so in this in many ways is an innovation, and leadership is needed. And so police chiefs are needed to cultivate relationships with external researchers. For the most part, research about policing practices rigorous research doesn't happen unless there are external partners, because there's a lot of work involved in doing rigorous research, and a lot of times police departments don't have the budget or the personnel to do that. And so police chiefs need to play an active role in cultivating those relationships. They also need to be receptive to change or innovation. They need to secure funding, so they need funding for training. If you're going to have the police departments do something different, it's going to require training, it's going to require funding, potentially new personnel. They need to encourage risk-taking and evaluation. They need to be able to communicate to stakeholders what is effective, what's not effective, and what do we not have research about. And so they also need to lastly facilitate access to evidence-based policing research and encourage its use. One thing that we know is that a sort of complaint or an issue in adopting evidence-based policing is that a lot of times police practitioners don't have access to the research about evidence-based policing. And so that's a hurdle. And they often don't have the time. So we need leaders that encourage them to sort of dig into this information and take the time to better understand it. And so what I'm going to show you here is that, once again, a preview of what's to come. And so when I set up these hypothetical applicants for police chief, there is an attribute, and it's regarding the applicant's emphasis on evidence-based policing. And there are essentially two options here. One, they help lead the implementation of evidence-based policing in their department, or two, they've been inducted into the Evidence-Based Policing Hall of Fame. And that's a real thing, so I didn't make that up. This is a real thing. And so the reason why I did this, and I'll talk about it here in a second, is that one could say anything about what they do. It's like, if I'm here and I could say, I'm a great dad. You don't know, I could just be making that up, right? And when it goes to, that's probably a poor example, and I am a good dad, I think. But it goes to this in that, everyone's going to say, oh yeah, I believe in evidence. Everyone's going to say, I believe in community policing. Everyone's going to say, I believe in diversity, or maybe not everyone, but maybe a lot of people. And so this is a costly signal. And so I'm going to talk about Evidence-Based Policing Hall of Fame here next. So this is evidence-based policing, once again, is a real thing. It's out of George Mason University, which I mentioned before. They have a huge evidence-based policing group. And here is what sort of the award is based on. It recognizes law enforcement practitioners who have been central to the role of implementation of a high-quality research program in their agency, and the relentless champions of institutionalizing evidence-based practices. So not only do they implement evidence-based practices, but they also work with researchers to evaluate their various programs and policies. So here are the membership requirements. They have to obviously be a member of a law enforcement agency, either as a sworn officer or a civilian employee. The first inductees were in 2009, and there are currently 66 members in this group. The second sort of thing that I'm going to emphasize in this, though once again I have other criteria in the experiment, I'm just focusing on these two, is professional standards. And the reason I didn't mention this, but the reason why I focus on evidence-based policing and professional standards is that these are two of the sort of biggest innovations, arguably, in policing over the last 50 years. And so I have two personas regarding professional standards. The first one is they help lead the implementation of professional standards in their department. And the second is they help lead a department to earn accreditation from the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. So one is a more costly signal than the other. And so now I'm going to talk about what CLIA is. It's a real sort of thing. CLIA was created in 1979 by four sort of founding police organizations. The first one is the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Second one is National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Third, the National Sheriff's Association. And fourth, the Police Executive Research Forum. And the idea behind CLIA is that it provides public safety agencies with support and accountability in voluntarily meeting an established set of professional standards. So police departments don't have to be accredited. Most police departments are not accredited. So I don't know about your current city. I can look it up, but most police departments aren't accredited. I learned this, so if you know me, I rave about this all the time. So now you'll know. But essentially, and so this is voluntary, and so this is a costly signal, as I'll talk about in the next slide. So what CLIA requires? So it requires comprehensive and uniform written directives that clearly define authority, performance, and responsibilities. And so not only do you have these directives, but you have to show proof that you are adhering to these directives. And they'll say in the next slide, I'll just tell you now, it takes about 2 to 3 years for departments to become accredited. So it's a lot of work to become accredited. They have to generate reports and analyses to make fact-based and informed management decisions. They have to have an independent review by subject matter experts. There's a couple other things. They are required to do a resident survey every couple of years, and there's a requirement for them to have some sort of analysis. I forget what the exact wording is, but they have to do evidence-based analysis of their procedures, some form. It's very sort of broadly worded. And so part of when I originally thought this, sort of conceptualizing this and thinking about this, is that, there is alignment between this CLIA and also evidence-based policing. I'm just distinguishing one as evidence-based and the other as professional standards because it's just easier to make sense of that. But there is some overlap between those two. So here's how CLIA works. As I said, if a department says they want to be accredited, they enter a self-assessment period. It generally takes 2 to 3 years. They often have to have a staff member sort of fill out all the paperwork to show their compliance. Once that work has been completed, they have a virtual site visit and then an in-person visit in which they also meet with community members. From there, once they're accredited, they have a virtual review every year, and then for 3 years. In the 4th year, they have another in-person site visit. Thank you. And so I have a hypothesis. So one, I haven't made a hypothesis about which of these sort of attributes or of the applicant matters the most. And so perhaps there is a good hypothesis for that you can sort of inform me about. But I do make a hypothesis about whether for the two variables or attributes, if you will, emphasis on professional standards and emphasis on evidence-based policing. And so I'll talk about my hypothesis in relation to those two. I've already sort of signaled it previously, but I'll talk about it here. So as you can imagine, participants will prefer applicants with external credentials related to evidence-based policing and CLIA than participants without them. This is based on signaling theory. So signaling theory argues that an applicant knows their quality, but the people that they are speaking with or that are recruiting them don't know their quality. There's information asymmetry as a consequence. And so high quality candidates, which is this next point, will go out of their way or are motivated to get external credentials or extra credentials so they can signal their quality to a hiring board or whatever, to the public. And so because of that, these external signals sort of signal to the public or whoever is sort of evaluating these people that they are motivated because they're going out of their way to signal their quality. And so there's some research about this, some research by Manny Teodoro. He looked at local governments and found that agency heads who were hired from the outside were more likely to have innovations and these extra credentials. And then there was another paper by Zheng who looked at city managers, and he looked at people at diagonal career paths, so hired outside, and they were more likely to have ICMA credentials, so International City Management Association credentials. So that's part of my hypothesis. About the ordering, I don't know. So we'll find out. So the method is a conjoint analysis, and kind of what I showed you before. It provides a response with hypothetical scenarios and asks them to make decisions based on various alternatives. The benefits of this is that it's realism, its capacity to stimulate trade-offs or simulate trade-offs, and uncover respondents' sort of unconscious preferences. There are 2 dimensions to conjoint experiments: attributes and levels. And so attributes in this case are the dimension of the candidate that are important to the public, and levels are the values that each attribute takes on. And so here we sort of getting to the main event. So for current position, that's an attribute, and they have two levels. Is the applicant an assistant chief of police or a chief of police? We have years of experiment. There are three attributes: 20 years, 25 years, and 30 years. Population they're currently serving in. Is it smaller than the respondent city, the same size as the respondent city, or larger than the respondent city? And there's emphasis on professional standards. Once again, did they say they've helped lead the implementation of professional standards in the department? They've helped lead the CLIA accreditation, then emphasis on evidence-based policing, as I mentioned before. Have they helped lead the implementation of evidence-based policing, or were they inducted into the Evidence-Based Policing Hall of Fame? And so once again, I assume, or I hypothesize that the external signals will matter more than the non, but we don't know about the which attributes will be weighed most heavily. And so part of what you might say here is, well, why did you choose these attributes? So I'll say that briefly. So part of this, in doing this, is that if you have too many attributes and too many levels, it becomes way too burdensome for survey takers. And so that's part of the, so that's why I stuck with these. I also stuck with these is that these are very objective and sort of discrete. And so having ones that are sort of less objective and less discrete sort of creates some fuzziness. And so there are ideas for adding more, and so I'm always open to that, but I'm just sort of hinting you as to why I chose these. And these do matter to respondents. So once again, this is a participant view. I'll sort of talk about some of this now, but they compared two, and they did 9 sets of 2 comparisons. And that's all within recommendations in terms of the number of attributes is within recommendations, the number of levels is within the recommendations, the number of choices between alternatives, and the number of choice sets are all within recommendations about avoiding sort of fatigue for respondents. These respondents from the website, recruited from the website Prolific, and the reason why we chose Prolific was very sort of intentional in that they've been proven to have really high quality samples, which matters obviously now in an age of AI. And they have, and also conjointly is the software that I use, they have all sorts of checks as well. US adults aged 18 and older were my sample, and there's a sort of an option on Prolific where you can mirror the US Census demographics, and so that's what we chose. It's roughly similar. Speeding ahead, we did calculations, and it requires a sample size of 200. We had 303. Once again, 2 options per set, 9 sets, median time 8 minutes. We did a treatment check to make sure they understood what these various, okay, thank you, these various designations mean. So respondent demographics, pretty roughly approximating the main sort of sore spot is Latinos are underrepresented. So roughly similar except for that demographic. So first result, how important is each attribute relative to the other attributes across respondents? This one I didn't really know. So this is the relative importance scores, and at the top was emphasis on professional standards, then emphasis on evidence-based policing. Third, population of the city the applicant is currently serving in. 4th, years of experience, and 5th, current position. If you look closely, some of those confidence intervals overlap, so we did a bunch of other tests. But I guess what I found surprising, and there is some qualitative component which I ran this morning, so you can, but I saw it earlier and it kind of makes sense. Current position I was surprised by, and years of experience I was a bit surprised that they was right at the bottom, but we can talk about that. So once again, because those confidence intervals overlap, we did a bunch of tests, pair T-test, all these tests, I'll just say that. Basically, evidence-based policing, professional standards, and population size were not distinguishable statistically. They were all sort of at the top. Then years of experience, and lastly, current position. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then this question of considering the average respondent, what levels do they prefer? And so negative means they have a dispreference, which I was surprised that that's a word, but apparently it is a word. And then positive is a preference. So a dispreference for assistant chief of police, but a preference. And so part of this is that for each attribute they total 0, so they're 0 scored. Dispreference for 20 years of experience, small preference for 25 years, a stronger preference for 30 years, dispreference for smaller size, small preference for same size, and strong preference for larger. And so you can see dispreference for helping lead, strong preference for having the credential, and the same for professional standards. And so once again, this is helpful, but in some ways, if there are only 2 options, it's going to be a dispreference for one and a preference for the other. So I had an open-ended question that a lot of this I'm still analyzing, to be honest with you, but so I welcome your feedback. But there was a question, in your own words, which factors were most important to you when evaluating the police chief candidates? I would probably ask a different question if I were to do it again, but there were some things that I learned. So one thing about assistant chiefs applying is that some folks felt that it was showing that they're ambitious, right? Like it wasn't that they were less qualified, that they may be qualified, and the fact that they're applying suggests to level of ambition. And I think that's sort of part of the reason why it wasn't weighed more heavily. There was a lot about, people really cared about population size. They felt that just coming from a larger city, they would just have a lot more knowledge and expertise about a whole variety of things. And they were concerned about, in the opposite way, about coming from a smaller city. But there's still more to dig in there. I need to dig in more. So the first thing is that the public has preferences, and those preferences are largely distinguishable. And so I think the thing that I want to emphasize here is that in a democracy, I think it's always useful to ask people what they want. And so if nothing else, that's what this project does. Hopefully it's more than that. But I think this is a start of, hopefully, more research into thinking about what do people want in a police chief for a variety of reasons. And I can tell you about another study I did about this if you want to hear about it. But as you know, we found evidence-based policing, professional standards, and population size matters to the public more so than years of experience and current position. The public is sensitive to external signals, so clearly this more costly signal meant something to the public. Costly signals matter, and assistant police chiefs applying may signal some sense of ambition, so it's not sort of wholly discounted. Obviously some limitations, not all potential attributes included. I need a more explanation of the why of evidence-based policing and professional standards, and possibly explore moderators. The last thing I'll say is that if we want evidence-based policing, if we want professional standards, police chiefs need some motivation or incentive to actually be evidence-based and to pursue professional standards. If we have some evidence that the public cares about these professional standards, then that may be some motivation for them to actually better implement or be more motivated to implement both evidence-based policing and professional standards. And with that, thank you for listening.
Let me just start by saying that I enjoy reading the paper very much, and also your presentation. I think it asks a very important question, and the design is very thoughtful and interesting. There's some interesting findings. So the first question is the sort of the big picture question here about the realism and how these public preferences for a chief actually connect to the process of selecting a police chief. Because police chiefs are not elected, they are appointed. So I do wonder, why public preferences matter here, and through what mechanisms do mayors or the city council anticipate public reaction to their selection? Are they being held directly accountable for their selection? Do they anticipate consequences or things like that? So what are the mechanisms here? We think that public preferences do matter. And honestly, sometimes I feel like, a lot of times what the public wants in a police chief probably won't line perfectly up with what the administrators or the politicians or even the union wants in a police chief, right? So in the real world, you mentioned this also, like there are a lot of other attributes you didn't include here. Probably the general public cares other factors like crime, their prior performance, scandal, media coverage, community relationships, all the other things. So I do want to hear a little bit more about like how did you end up choosing these attributes, what it was left out, and how the author think about like the gap between the experiment setting versus the real world. So that's the first question. And the second question is, so I'm debating myself when I try to interpret these results. So I'm looking at the design of the treatment here. So you essentially find that the public sort of prefers the candidates with the clear accreditation and the EBP, evidence-based policing Hall of Fame, right? So I'm thinking, like, what are the things that the respondents actually responding to here? So the design may pick up a few things at the same time. It could be the substance of evidence-based policing and accreditation versus they're not doing that, or it could be the external validation, right? Because this is like a third party confirming that they're doing a great job. So they might be responding to the external validation that it is a signal for their quality and competence. And there's another possibility. They may be just responding to the language here, because the control condition is like a plain description of what they have done, right? Versus this is the EBP Hall of Fame, which seems like a fancy word for a layperson who does not know much about these practices and institutions, right? So I think the paper could benefit a little bit more from being explicit about the designs picking up several things at the same time. And I don't think this invalidated results. It's the effect there. The effect is the effect, but it does influence how we interpret from the findings. So that's the second point. And the third one is I'm curious about the heterogeneity, because you show us there's demographic variation in the respondents pool, right? So it might be interesting to look into like along race or gender or age group. What are there might be heterogeneous effects in addition to the average overall effects. And another thing is I think the paper can have a chance to be even more clear about its contribution. So first of all, sometimes I read this paper as like a policing paper, and sometimes it reads like more like a general paper about leadership selection. So I do want to hear a little bit more from you, like what do you see as the main contribution here? And it also depends on like which journal you're going to send it to. It's more public administration journal or it's a policing journal, right? So that's another point. Another thing I was thinking, this is sort of stepping aside from the current experiment itself, but evidence-based policing, I kind of feel like has become a buzzword in the field. So what does this word actually signal to the public? What are the public thinking about when they see the evidence-based policing and stuff? Like, are they thinking about efficiency, transparency, accountability, fairness, legitimacy, whatever the public perception might be? That could also be sort of a thing you want to consider in the paper. So that's my discussion, and I will open the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, those are all great questions, and I'll try my best to answer them, but because they're all great questions, I might not answer them perfectly. So there was this great question about, how did I choose these? What about crime? Because crime matters to people. What about prior performance? And that's all fair point, and I could have, maybe should have included that. I think the tough part about crime is that you can sort of cook data to say that you lowered crime no matter where somebody's a police chief. Something went down in some city for some random reason. And so I think I try to think of things that people could say that could be objectively proven or disproven, right? And so if crime goes down, was it really the police chief, or did unemployment go down and that's what drove it? And so I think that's important, and I'm not saying I shouldn't have included, I'm just telling you my train of thought of any chief somewhere, anywhere in the country could find something that went down and claim credit for that thing going down. And so, what's that, sorry?
Or change the definition of crime.
Oh, right, just a different type of crime. One crime. Yes, yeah, exactly. And so I get why you asked. I'm just telling you my sort of train of thought. That's a great point. And then another thing that you talked about, heterogeneity, that's something that we need to look into deeper. That's just a great point. You talked about this idea of, is it the substance versus the prestige? And that's a great point. I've gotten that feedback before, and to be honest, I need to dig into the qualitative component before, but I don't think I can tell, to be honest with you. And so I'll think more about how to sort of tease that out. I thought about having a condition where they said, they didn't do evidence-based policing. But the problem with that is no one's going to say I'm not an evidence-based police chief, or no one's going to say that I didn't implement professional standards. And that would have helped. But it's kind of, so I get your point and I can't answer it, but I'm just telling you the thought process. So yeah, so that was a challenge. Were you going to say something in response or no?
No. I was saying that control condition would be like inauthentic.
Okay, right. Yeah, that's sort of what I was dealing with. Your point about policing versus leadership, I haven't sort of decided. I haven't written well about which. So that's sort of a great point. What does evidence-based policing mean to the public? That's another great point, and it's something that I need to think about more. It is a buzzword. The reason why I chose these external credentials is because it gets beyond a buzzword. Like, you actually have to prove that you are an evidence-based police chief. You have to prove that you believe in these credentials. And so that's why I'm obviously clearly into credentials, because it gets beyond treating everything like a buzzword and people being able to say that I do this or I do that. There's some sort of external validation. So thank you.
Really good, thank you. Okay, so I've got Guo, I've got Frank, I've got Ben. Raise your hand, catch my eye if you want to get the cue. Yeah, go ahead, Guo.
So, I mean, super interesting, and I love the leadership angle. And so I was thinking the same thing about political selection, right? So,
Oh yeah, I didn't answer that.
I was wondering, it seems it would be really nice to do a survey on at least on a select few of mayors.
Sure.
And see, is there a gap?
Sure.
Do they prefer it as much as the population, right? Because if there's no gap, then in a way it's fine, right? You're just going through that appointment channel. So that seems like super interesting. And then I thought, I remember like Santa Clara, for example, there must be cities, like very obscure, like some places that have direct elections, no? So
LA
it
County?
seems like,
Okay.
LA County, okay, obscure, not that
Sheriff.
sheriff, okay, but I was thinking police chief. So it would be nice to just look at sort of real choices, just to complement that, to say maybe there's a way to get at this, but I don't know how salient it is. Like you say, nobody would say I don't care about professional standards, perhaps, right? But that seems nice if you could somehow connect that to some real choices.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, to this point of, most cities, the police chief is, appointed, and it's sort of more decided by elites is a great point, and maybe talking with elites is a great point as well. I guess the only thing, so that's a fair point. The only thing I'll say in defense of this is that there's nothing that the public can do unilaterally in general. Like all the policing reforms, the public doesn't have the ability to sort of implement a policing reform. All of that is sort of channeled through elites. And we still ask about those sorts of things. Basically, there's exceptions, but we sort of choose the elites by voting, and then from there they make decisions for all sorts of things. But it's still important to know what the public wants. I know you're not. You're very
I'm just saying
nice.
it would be interesting to know. Do they know what the voters want?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And maybe they don't, and then that would make it, even more interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So Frank is next.
So thank you, first of all, and Dany's question actually, I want to kind of frame it a little bit more into the real world. There are sheriffs that are elected, and second, most police chiefs are not selected by people, nor mayors for that matter. We are a council manager system of government for the most part in the United States of America. Certainly in California, most of our cities are council manager systems. I think your research would be very useful to public administration if you were to focus from the perspective of the city manager rather than the people. Because most police chiefs are going to be appointed by a city manager. It's not going to be the people or the mayor. So that would be very helpful, and it will advance public administration in the sense that if there are any particular criteria or really why a city manager should select a particular police chief, I think you'll do great good for public administration.
I appreciate that. Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Thank you. I just started doing this, so this is a great sort of next segue to get into that.
Ben?
So I won't pile into this too much more, but I'll just say that I think you could benefit here from spending just a little bit more time talking through why public perception of this matters. And you did a little bit at the end. We talked about like how police chiefs might respond if they knew that the public cared about this stuff. But I think there's just like from a broader theoretical perspective, given the nuances, just like why a general public sample is useful in the situation would go a long way.
Sure, yeah, that's fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, Roxanne, and then I'll put myself.
I don't know if this is an appropriate question, but
I like this already. All right.
Well, I wonder, and maybe it's also my lack of understanding of the overall topic, but when I think of policing, especially given recent times and more common with public opinions, policing has been rooted in white supremacy and yes, I'll leave it there for now. And so I'm curious to see if that conversation is something that has been thought of when thinking about this, or is that maybe more appropriate for a different conversation?
Oh, I appreciate it. I like your question. I think that, so a lot of that there's a lot of research about descriptive representation, and there's some research about descriptive representation in terms of police chiefs. And so that research is really important. I think something to think about in terms of that particular area of research is that, just because someone shares your identity doesn't mean necessarily they share your values. And so that's sort of another layer to that. I think another thing I've learned from doing interviews with police chiefs is that they're very aware of the current climate, and they are sophisticated in understanding that there are a lot of nuances that law enforcement hasn't sort of been appreciative in the past. And so I guess there's a lot of hope, at least in my mind, doing these sort of interviews through IRB, is that they're very aware of the challenges created in policing and are being more thoughtful about how to sort of navigate them. And I guess I don't know if this is answering your question, hopefully in some way. We can always talk about it afterwards. But we saw this sort of in the evidence-based policing. The stuff we know about evidence-based policing is that police chiefs are often much more aware of what those terms mean, and often much more integrated into that sort of group. And so I think there is a big difference between sort of the thinking of people at the top of the chain than maybe necessarily people at the bottom of the chain. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope so. I appreciate your question.
So I'm here to defend the public opinion.
Okay, all right. Finally.
And I'll tell you why, because it's one of the most public-facing things that electeds do is appoint people like police chiefs. So when the mayor chooses a candidate, they are definitely concerned about public opinion. They're obsessed with public opinion. They're thinking about the next election and how this appointment is going to look in that next election. So I actually think public-facing elements of this job make the public opinion critical. So A, that's my one point. B is that, one thing you could do with your data, so these are all comments, not questions, is weight your sample to see if elites are looking at this differently than let's say you could look at educational elites, you could look at economic elites and see if they have different perceptions. And then the next paper you do, what you do is rerun this, but as the treatment, don't have a lack of professionalism as the one of the treatments, but instead have some like highly emotive appeal. Okay. And what we really want to know is, will emotive appeals, shocking amounts of crime, or maybe something that's racially charged or something like this, how does that compete with professionalism in the public mind? All comments, not questions.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Yeah, because a lot of what's in the newspaper is these highly emotive, supercharged things.
So yeah, I like professionalism if the alternative is no professionalism. Do I like professionalism a lot if the alternative is some sort of emotive appeal to crime and justice?
Okay, sure, yeah.
Okay, Michael has a question.
This is a question with regards to what Professor had talked about in terms of public perception. Is it that public perception, is that driven by, in terms of evidence-based policing, is that driven by the latest news story or some new body cam footage of something horrible happening, or is that something that you've seen in terms of research with regards to this paper or any future work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's not a whole lot about what the public knows about evidence-based policing, so there's a lot more work needed there, and I think that goes to a point Dany made. I think one thing I've learned about policing is that things, not just policing, any major visible institution, is that opinion can shift very quickly, and a lot to these sort of highly emotive and charged events. Which, if they're real events, they make a lot of sense because police have a lot of power, but we don't know a whole lot about how. Well, I guess in some way, and then it also gets this idea of how does the public define evidence-based policing. So obviously we know from the murder of George Floyd that there was a lot of interest in particular policies. People became very informed about a whole host of policies. And so in that way, yeah, maybe it sort of increased interest in those policies. Whether you define them as evidence-based or not is sort of or at least the scholars or you or the general public or whoever, is another issue, but that's a good question, and I think it points back to this idea that I need to think more about what the public thinks of evidence-based policing. So, thank you.
Last question. Dany.
I'm just curious about, do you know how much the average public actually is familiar with these two practices or institutions? I mean, evidence-based policing maybe is a buzzword that some people may have heard of, but the CLIA accreditation, it seems to get too much into the weeds of the operation. If it's not something that I have ever heard about, how am I supposed to decide, I like this attribute or not?
Yeah, it is difficult. But I think what's interesting is that it is a signal that they're picking up on, and we can debate whether it's the right signal or not, but it's a signal that they seem to use in their judgments. But I think to your point, there's probably a lot of noise, and I think to your point, it's also probably prestige is something that they might be picking up on. And so it's maybe more a prestige. I think maybe I'm so thinking about this from my angle of, I think it's a good thing. Whatever they think, as long as they pick up on it and if they know about it or not, then I'm sort of satisfied.
Yeah, if you can show data saying that they're not very familiar with the substance of that, then you can sort of rule out that possibility and saying that your mechanism, your treatment is picking up on the external validation point, right?
That's a good point.
It's less about the substance, but about the third-party verification that is good, right?
I'm glad you said that. I dropped from the sample, and I thought about doing this, or I forgot, but I'm glad you said it because you reminded me. I dropped from the sample, so I did a knowledge check, so I told them what it was and afterward, but I could put back in the people that got it wrong, and then use that to sort of distinguish whether it's about the substance or whether it's about sort of prestige.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.